Murder is never simple. But when the victim is a doctor, a man sworn to save lives, the cut is always deeper. When Dr. Michael Carrington was found slumped over his desk, a bullet lodged in his chest, the headlines told one story. A shocking crime, a loss to the medical community, a life taken too soon. But the truth? The truth had been festering long before the gun was ever fired. Dr. Carrington was no ordinary victim. To some, he was a savior, respected, admired. To others, he was a man who knew too much, who held the wrong secrets in his hands. And for Jessica Ellis, he was something else entirely. The reason her brother was dead. The reason she couldn't sleep at night. The reason she picked up a gun. What pushes someone past the point of no return? Is it loss? Is it rage? Or is it a choice made in the silence, long after the fight has been lost? Jessica Ellis didn't run. She didn't hide. She was waiting when the police arrived. And yet, when they asked why, she didn't give them the answer they expected. Because this wasn't just about Michael Carrington. This was about a system that let him thrive. A system that buried the truth along with its victims. A system that protected the powerful and left the innocent to die. The question isn't who pulled the trigger. The question is, why did it take so long? Dr. Michael Carrington knew exactly how to play the part. He shook hands at fundraisers, posed for photos with sick children, and spoke about the importance of healthcare for all. People believed in him. They donated money. They trusted their families in his care. He was the kind of doctor who made promises, promises of healing, of hope. But promises mean nothing when the person making them is only in it for himself. Dr. Michael Carrington wasn't just stealing from the government. He was stealing time, hope, and lives. Every dollar he funneled into his accounts came at the cost of real people, desperate patients who believed they were receiving care. Some were given expired medications. Others were sent home with false reassurances. And some, like Martha Diaz, never had a chance. Martha was 53 years old, a mother of 3, a woman who had spent her whole life putting others first, working double shifts to pay rent, skipping meals so her children wouldn't have to. She had been feeling sick for months, but she put off seeing a doctor. She couldn't afford it. When the pain in her stomach became unbearable, she finally walked through the doors of Carrington's hospital, praying for help. He told her exactly what she wanted to hear. "We'll take care of you." He ran tests, nodded sympathetically, scheduled follow-ups. He even helped her apply for Medicaid coverage. But that was all part of the act. Carrington had already been paid. Her name was on the forms, the money had been approved. But the treatment? That never came. Weeks passed. Martha called, begged for updates, but was always told the same thing. Her paperwork was still processing. Her results weren't in yet. She just needed to wait a little longer. What she didn't know was that Carrington had never ordered the full set of tests. He had never intended to treat her. As long as her name remained on his patient list, he could keep billing Medicaid for visits she never had, medications she never received. By the time another doctor finally saw her, it was too late. Stage 4 stomach cancer. If she had received treatment when she first walked into Cedar Grove Hospital, she might have had a fighting chance. Instead, she spent her final weeks in agony. While the man who let her die continued cashing government checks, Martha's story wasn't unique. It was one of dozens, maybe even hundreds. And Nate Ellis suspected something was wrong long before he had proof. He had met Martha's daughter, Rosa, at the hospital one evening. She had come in screaming, demanding answers. "You let my mother die," she shouted at the receptionist. "You told her she was fine until it was too late." Nate had tried to calm her down, had promised to look into her mother's file. But when he did, something didn't sit right. The records were incomplete. Notes were missing. It was as if someone had gone in and erased parts of her medical history. It wasn't until that night, when he found the original medical files in Carrington's office, and noticing the timeline of events, that he understood the full picture. There were more patients just like Martha. People who had trusted Carrington, only to be ignored, discarded when their illnesses became too real to hide. Patients who should have received chemotherapy but never did. patients who had been diagnosed too late because their tests were delayed on purpose. Carrington didn't just steal money. He stole time, the one thing none of them could afford to lose. Nate had proof now. He knew exactly what Carrington had done. He had names, records, undeniable evidence of fraud, medical malpractice, and something much worse, murder by neglect. He was ready to go to the authorities. But Nate never got the chance. 2 days after accessing those files, Nate was found dead in his apartment. The official cause? Cocaine overdose. His co-workers were shocked. His friends were confused. But no one was more devastated than his sister, Jessica. She knew her brother. Nate never touched drugs. He didn't even drink. He was careful, responsible. He had just started his career. He had too much to lose. But when she told the police, they didn't listen. They had a toxicology report, and to them, that was all that mattered. But Jessica knew better. And she knew one thing for certain. If Nate was dead, it wasn't by choice. Someone had silenced him. Grief is supposed to fade with time. But for Jessica Ellis, every passing day only sharpened the edges of her loss. Her brother was dead. The world had moved on. And yet, nothing about his death made sense. It wasn't just the toxicology report or the way the case had been closed so quickly. It was the silence. The way no one asked questions. The way Carrington kept walking free, his reputation untouched, while Nate, who had done nothing but try to do the right thing, was gone. She refused to accept it. If the police wouldn't investigate, she would. Because this wasn't just an overdose. This was murder. Jessica started with Nate's apartment. She had been there 100 times before, but this time, she looked at everything differently. His desk, his shelves, his laptop, every detail, every scrap of paper, anything that could hold a clue. The laptop was the obvious place to start, but when she powered it on, she hit a dead end. His files had been wiped. Whoever killed him had been thorough, but Nate had always been careful. He wouldn't have left something so important out in the open. Jessica turned to the one thing no one else would have thought to check, his diary. It wasn't much, just a small notebook tucked away in his drawer, filled with messy handwriting and scattered thoughts. At first, it was just ordinary notes, frustrations about work, reminders to call their mother, random sketches. But then, she saw it, a single sentence, hastily scribbled on the edge of a page. Carrington is hiding something. Need to find proof. That was all he had written. No details. No explanation. Just a sentence, a warning, left behind by someone who knew he was getting too close to something dangerous. It wasn't enough. Jessica needed more. She started visiting Nate's workplace, talking to people who had known him. Most were hesitant to speak. Either they were afraid, or they had already convinced themselves that what happened to Nate was just a tragedy, not something worth questioning. But there was one person who told her exactly what she needed to hear. A nurse, her voice low, glancing over her shoulder as she spoke. The week before he died, he had a fight with Carrington. It was bad. He called him a murderer. Said he knew what he was doing to those patients. Jessica's hands tightened into fists. Her brother hadn't just suspected Carrington of fraud. He had confronted him. And now he was dead. That was when the pieces started falling into place. The missing files, the diary entry, the argument at the hospital. Nate had found something big enough to make Carrington nervous. And if she was going to prove it, she had to get inside his world. But Carrington was careful. He was working with some people in the hospital, and he had friends in high places, connections that made him untouchable. If she went to the police with nothing but suspicions, they'd shut the door in her face. She needed evidence, real, undeniable evidence. And to get it, she had to take a risk. Jessica wasn't a tech expert. She didn't know much about coding or hacking. But she knew how to adapt, how to make the impossible possible. Determined to expose the truth, she spent days digging through forums, watching tutorials, and reaching out to a friend who was more familiar with technology. Together, they figured out a way to gain access to Carrington's system. It wasn't going to be easy. She couldn't just waltz into the hospital and start installing software. But with the help of her friend, they crafted a plan. The breakthrough came when her friend sent an email, seemingly innocuous, with an attachment Carrington would never suspect. When the email landed in his inbox, all he needed to do was open it. A simple click and the tracking malware was inside his system, ready to track every move. For weeks, they monitored. At first, it was just financial records, confirmation of everything Nate had suspected. Carrington was still running the fraud scheme, still billing for fake procedures, still making money off people who never saw a dime of it. But as she dug deeper, she found something far worse. There were mails sent about drug trials. Stories buried beneath layers of security, never meant to be seen by the outside world. Patients who had been given drugs they never agreed to take. People who had walked into the hospital for minor illnesses and walked out permanently damaged. Some didn't walk out at all. One mail described a woman who had come in for routine pain management. She was prescribed a new experimental treatment. She died 3 days later. No one reported it. No one investigated. Another mail detailed a man with chronic migraines, given an unapproved drug without his knowledge. He suffered a seizure and never woke up. Jessica scrolled through the names, the symptoms, the deaths, one after another. The hospital wasn't just a front for fraud, it was a testing ground. Carrington had been using his patients like lab rats, running illegal trials on the people who had nowhere else to turn. And when things went wrong, he covered it up, erasing records, forging death certificates, bribing anyone who could cause trouble. This wasn't just about money. This was about human lives. Jessica's hands shook as she closed her laptop. She had the truth now, the kind of evidence that could destroy Carrington for good. But as she stared at the screen, at the names of the people who had suffered and died, one question echoed in her mind. Who was going to believe her? The police wouldn't help. That much was clear. Carrington had spent years buying protection, burying whistleblowers, making sure that no one could touch him. If she walked into a precinct with this information, she knew exactly what would happen. Nothing. At best, they'd ignore her. At worst, they'd tip him off. That was when Jessica realized she only had one option left. She wasn't going to the police. She wasn't going to the press. She was going straight to Carrington himself. The hospital was silent, a stark contrast to the storm building in Jessica's chest. It was late, past midnight, when she made her way down the dimly lit hallway, the click of her boots the only sound breaking the quiet. She had been there countless times before, but tonight, everything was different. Tonight, there would be no more pretending, no more waiting. Tonight, she was walking into the lion's den with only one purpose, to make Michael Carrington pay. Her heart was racing, but her hands were steady. Inside her coat pocket, she felt the cold weight of the weapon she had carried for weeks, the weapon she hoped she would never need to use. But there were no other options now. After everything, after losing Nate, after uncovering the truth, after seeing the bodies of those Carrington had discarded like trash, there was no turning back. Justice wouldn't come from the law. It wouldn't come from anyone but her. When Jessica reached Carrington's office, she didn't hesitate. She didn't knock or announce herself. She just opened the door, her eyes locking with his as she stepped into the room. The smug smile on Carrington's face faltered for just a second as he looked up from his phone. He was alone, in his office, completely unaware that his entire empire was about to crumble. Jessica stood in the doorway, her eyes never leaving his. She could hear her breath, sharp and steady in the silence. Carrington didn't move, didn't speak at first. His eyes flickered to the gun in her hand, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't afraid of her, not yet. He wasn't afraid of anything. "You don't know who you're dealing with," Carrington said with a smirk, his voice calm, almost mocking. "You can't scare me. You think anyone will believe you? You think the police will care? I'm untouchable. I've built my empire. No one can touch me. Not even you." Jessica didn't blink. She stepped forward, just enough to close the distance between them. She reached into her bag, pulling out a stack of papers, files, photographs, records, and notes. Proof. She slammed them onto the desk, the noise breaking the tension like glass shattering on a hard floor. This is your empire, Carrington, she said, her voice cold. This is your legacy. These are the lives you've ruined, the people you've murdered. And these are the things my brother found out before you killed him. You can lie all you want. You can call it whatever you want. But I have the truth. And I'm going to make sure everyone hears it. Carrington's expression didn't change. He stared at the papers, the evidence spread out before him like an open wound. He let out a slow, mocking laugh, his eyes never leaving hers. You're delusional, he said, leaning back in his chair, the smugness returning to his features. You think you can just waltz in here and make me confess? You think you're going to get away with this? You're a fool. You're nothing. Jessica's grip tightened on the gun. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice was steady, cold. You killed my brother, she said, the words thick with rage. You made sure he couldn't breathe long enough to expose you. You killed him because he was trying to do the right thing. And I'm going to make sure you pay for it. Carrington's eyes darkened for a moment. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping the edge of his desk. You don't get it, do you? He sneered. You're just like everyone else. You think you can stop me, but you won't. No one can. Your brother's dead, and nothing you do will bring him back. Nothing you do will change anything. Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. She had heard enough. She wasn't there to listen to his threats, to hear his excuses. She was there to end it all. You're wrong, she said, her voice low and steady. Because I'm the one who's going to make you disappear. Carrington's laugh was a bitter, ugly sound. He stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he walked toward her. He was trying to intimidate her, trying to make her back down. You think you have the power? You're just a girl who's too emotional to think straight. If you're smart, you'll walk away now. You don't want to end up like your brother. The words hit her like a slap in the face. He said it so casually, like he was talking about the weather. You don't want to end up like your brother. For a split second, Jessica's world went blank. The grief, the anger, the overwhelming sense of betrayal. All of it crashed into her like a storm. Her chest tightened, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. She felt the heat of tears threatening to rise, but she wouldn't let them. Not now. Not after everything he had taken from her. Her hand moved swiftly, almost instinctively. Before Carrington had a chance to react, the cold metal of the gun was in her grip, aimed squarely at his chest. The man who had destroyed her family, her brother, her life. In that moment, everything she had lost surged within her. And she knew she couldn't turn back. Carrington froze, the arrogance fading from his face. His eyes widened ever so slightly, a flicker of real fear finally creeping in. He had always underestimated her, thought her weak, vulnerable. But now, in this final moment, he realized how wrong he had been. I warned you, Jessica said, her voice low and steady, each word cutting through the tension like a blade. But it looks like you didn't listen. And then she fired. The gunshot echoed through the sterile hallways of the clinic, the sharp sound tearing through the silence. It rang out like a death knell, loud enough for the whole hospital to hear. Security rushed in seconds later, alarms blaring, but it was already too late. Carrington lay motionless, the life drained from him. Jessica stood there, frozen in place, the weight of her actions settling in the stillness of the room. Jessica stood there, the gun still in her hand. She had come here for justice, for closure. But now she wasn't sure anymore. Was this the right thing to do? Would killing him truly bring her peace? The room was still, and in that silence, Jessica made a decision. When the police arrived at Carrington's hospital, they didn't expect to find what they did. The hospital, usually a place where hope was supposed to be restored, now held a scene so raw and unyielding it seemed almost unreal. Jessica was sitting on the floor, the cold linoleum beneath her. The lifeless body of Michael Carrington sprawled in front of her. The gun was beside her, discarded like an afterthought. Her face was streaked with tears, but her expression was vacant, hollow. There was no triumph in her eyes, no relief, Just an empty look that reflected the anguish and pain of a woman who had been pushed to the brink. When the officers entered, Jessica didn't move. She didn't try to run or hide. She didn't even attempt to offer an excuse or a lie. She simply stared at them, the weight of her actions pressing down on her like 1,000 tons. "I did it," she said quietly, her voice hoarse and broken. "I killed him." And so the confession came. The truth spilled out like a river breaking free from a dam. Jessica told them everything. The fraud, the patients Carrington had destroyed, the horrible experiments carried out on the innocent, and the murder of her brother. The reason she had walked into that hospital that night, the reason she had pulled the trigger. But confession, in her case, wasn't enough to absolve her of the gravity of what she'd done. She had taken a life, no matter the reason, and now she would have to face the consequences. Jessica was charged with second-degree murder. And when the trial began, it wasn't just the legal system that stood in judgment. It was the public. People across the country were divided. Some viewed her as a hero, someone who had taken justice into her own hands and rid the world of a man who had caused so much pain and destruction. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer, no different from the man she had killed. The courtroom was a spectacle. Journalists filled the seats, the cameras flashing like paparazzi as they caught every moment. Jessica's face, once full of life and hope, was now a mask of indifference. Her emotions, long buried under layers of grief and rage, were now locked away behind a wall of stoic silence. She said very little during the trial. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than words ever could. When her time on the stand came, Jessica gave a statement that would echo across the country. "I didn't kill him out of vengeance," she said, her voice unwavering despite the tears that threatened to spill over. "I killed him to protect others. He would have never stopped. If I hadn't done this, someone else would have been his next victim, and the world would have never known the truth." Her words cut deep, dividing the nation. Some saw her as a vigilante, a woman who took the law into her own hands in order to stop a monster who couldn't be stopped any other way. They believed she had saved countless lives by ending Carrington's reign of terror. Others saw her as a murderer, someone who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. No matter the reason, the act of taking a life was unforgivable in their eyes. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. 20 years. That was the sentence. 20 years behind bars for a woman who had sought justice with a gun in her hand, who had taken the law into her own hands, and who had ended the life of a man who, in many ways, had never truly been held accountable for his crimes. As Jessica sat there, her face emotionless, her fate sealed in the eyes of the law, she couldn't help but wonder, had it been worth it? She had lost her brother, the man who had been her only family. She had lost her freedom, her future, and her peace of mind. But even in that moment, as the gavel came down, she knew she had done what needed to be done. She had saved lives. She had exposed a monster. In the weeks and months that followed, Jessica's actions sparked a series of investigations. Carrington's crimes, the Medicaid fraud, the dangerous experiments, and the countless victims who had suffered at his hands. All of it was laid bare for the world to see. Several arrests followed, including Carrington's closest allies. The changes to Medicaid oversight were swift and severe. Reforms put in place to prevent another disaster like this from ever happening again. But for Jessica, none of it mattered. The victory was hollow. She had sacrificed everything. The man who had ruined so many lives was gone. But she would never be the same. She had saved others. But at what cost? Sitting alone in her cell, Jessica allowed herself one moment of reflection. She thought of Nate, the brother she had loved, the brother she had lost, and she wondered, for just a fleeting second, if she could have done something else. But deep down, she knew the answer. Carrington's death, however it had come about, had been inevitable, and she had been the one to bring it to an end. In the silence of the prison, she could hear the faint sound of her brother's voice in the back of her mind. He was gone, but in her heart, she had made sure that his death wasn't in vain. As the news of Jessica's actions spread across the nation, social media erupted in a frenzy. The internet was divided, as it always is when it comes to matters of justice. But this time, there was a sense of something different, something bigger. The hashtags began to flood in, #Justice for Jessica, #Vigilante Hero, #The Doctor Must Pay. People from all walks of life weighed in on her story, from armchair detectives to those who had suffered at the hands of the system she had exposed. Jessica may have lost her freedom, one post read, but she gave others a chance to fight back. She showed us that sometimes the law doesn't move fast enough, and sometimes we have to do what's necessary to protect the innocent. Another user wrote, "We may not all agree with how she handled it, but Carrington got what he deserved. He destroyed lives for years. She ended his reign." But not everyone saw it that way. A string of critical comments followed. "She took a life. That's not justice. That's murder. No matter what he did, no one has the right to decide who lives or dies." And then there were those who were torn, those who saw both sides of the story. They wrote, "I get it. She was desperate, heartbroken. But was it worth the cost? Should we let vengeance dictate who we become?" The debate raged on, from Facebook posts to tweets, news articles to podcasts. Some hailed Jessica as a hero, a woman who had taken matters into her own hands when the law failed. Others saw her as a criminal no different from the one she killed. And in the midst of it all, the question that lingered, was Jessica a hero? Or was she simply another victim of a broken system? As her story continued to unfold in the court of public opinion, one thing became clear. Jessica's actions had made people think, had made people question the very nature of justice. What happens when the law fails, when corruption thrives, when the system breaks down? Is vengeance ever justified, or does it always lead to more destruction? If this story gripped you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Let us know in the comments. Did Jessica go too far, or was her act justified? We want to hear your thoughts on this one.